There's something dangerous you're probably missing, and I need to tell you about it. As national writ and boundaries give way to centralized form of globalism, we're seeing supposedly peacenik alliances like the EU be tempted to usurp power and undo hard-fought national freedoms. Having this conversation that Jordan Peterson had with the man who was at the forefront of Brexit, Nigel Farage, will wake you up to this dangerous new trend. Subscribe to the channel for more discussions like this and watch this next clip before I tell you how it fits into a larger picture.
What do you think it was that alerted you so long ago to the dangers of the EU? And the reason I'm asking that is because there was reason for people to be hopeful about the EU project. The fact that you could travel in Europe without passports from country to country was interesting. There was a while when there seemed to be a real sheen on the EU project. And there was, of course, concerns after the First and Second World Wars that the project of nationalism had flaws built into it, especially on the European side, that were so massive that some other form of government might reasonably be attempted. The world is unifying more too, because we communicate with each other much more. Now, you were obviously very early in your apprehension that distributing power farther up the hierarchy to a unified, say, European government or the UN or the WEF for that matter, had serious flaws. So what do you think it was that made you alert to that so much before anyone else really cottoned on to it?
Well, I'm a sort of amateur historian. I love history, and I do think there are things we can learn from history. Sadly, we rarely do, but there are things we can learn. And here's the point. I mean, yes, of course, in 1870, the Germans invade France. In 1914, the Germans invade France. In 1940, the Germans invade France. And so this idea came around that if you unify France and Germany, and of course it began with the Coal and Steel Pact in 1951. If you unify France and Germany, if you unify the whole of Europe, those nationalistic factors that caused war would go away, and we could live in peace.
And you know what? There may even be some merit if you zoom into the picture, because economic interdependence has certainly been shown to reduce the likelihood for conflict. And considering that Europe is the world's largest and most lucrative market, it is set out to use that shared economic progress as a vehicle for peace. But wait, people that take that sole route are missing a vital part of the picture. It's that globalization is not the same as globalism. The former refers to a world of more free trade, communication, and culture, whereas the latter points more toward the erosion of national authority and autonomy into a centralized body. And the bitter truth is that the European Union in the past 15 years has begun a slow shift towards globalism and centralized authority to the point that it's resulting in a resurgence of national tendencies. That's exactly what Brexit was, and it ended up succeeding in pulling away perhaps the most important EU country.
But it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding. And the misunderstanding was that the existence of nation states led to war, but they made one fundamental error. And it's this: provided the nation state is acting as a functioning democracy, you don't have that problem. There is no example in history of one functioning democracy going to war with another. And far from being a project of peace, I took the opposite view. I took the view in about 1990, really. I took the view that if you take away from nation states their ability to determine their own future and hand it up to a higher authority over which you have little or no say, far from dampening nationalistic fervor, it's likely to increase nationalistic fervor. And here's the thing why democracy works. Democracy works because whether you like the result or not, you settle it with a cross on a piece of paper, and not with a gun. And so I actually felt that it was likely to provoke nationalistic terrorist groups, not to diminish them. So I took that big picture view a long time ago. And what happened was, you see, we did have a referendum on this back in the 70s. And my parents were told, look, vote to stay part of this because it's about trading with our neighbours. It's going to be good for business. It means we can travel to Europe freely. Ironically, pre-1914, we could travel all over Europe without even having a passport. That's been rather forgotten. And no one thought, or very few people thought back in the 70s, that it would threaten sovereignty, that it would threaten nation-state democracy. And as the years went by, a project that started around peace became a project about power. Tony Blair himself said, this is now a project of power. And the ambition of the European Union was actually to become the world's leading superpower.
If there's one thing you need to know about power, it's that it can corrupt, especially when it is centralized to such an extent. Europe's shift away from being a peace-driven union to now almost trying to be one pole in a new multipolar world was perhaps envisioned far back when it was founded, but it has only started manifesting now. And that's because two things have happened in the last 30 or so years. Firstly, it's the fall of the Soviet Union, and then the rise of China as a new global power against the United States, and countries like India looking to take the mantle in the next century. That means Europe as a platform was forced to pick a side on whether it wants to be primarily a defensive union, or one that is on the forefront of exerting its influence in global affairs. If you look at the fine print of the Treaty on European Union passed in 1992, you realize just how much of an integration it imagines between member states and everything from the economy and currency to foreign policy and even defense. Part of the treaty's list of objectives reads, and I quote, "The Union shall set itself the following objectives: to promote economic and social progress, to assert its identity on the international scene, in particular through the implementation of a common foreign and security policy, including the progressive framing of a common defense policy, to strengthen the protection of the rights and interests of the nationals." The question is, can it really achieve that last part of protecting rights and interests of nationals and member states without compromising on the previous objectives? It's a balancing act that seems to be tilting too far in the direction of eroding national interest and sovereignty of individual members to consolidate power in the center. And this sliding of the scale toward the globalist direction isn't really a secret either, because prominent left-wing politicians in the UK have made it clear why they believe staying in the EU is worth a sacrifice like that. Here's what UK's former Prime Minister Tony Blair said just a couple years ago.
That world in the middle of this century is going to have three giants. It's going to have America, China, probably India. Because these are large population countries. In the case of America, huge economy, huge amount of military power. These three giants are going to be much bigger and more powerful than country number 4. And then you're going to have the medium-sized countries. So a country like Indonesia is a population 3 times the size of Germany's. You can have the medium-sized. We're going to be Germany, Italy, France, Britain. Right, okay. In this world, if the medium-sized aren't banding together, the giants are going to sit in us. I mean, that's just the reality. And anyone who's ever dealt with power and sat in a room where there's power understands that when you're with a group of others and you're operating as one, as a strong collective, then your medium-sized countries banding together in that European Union are going to sit at that table with the three giants on equal terms. They're sitting as individuals, they're not sitting at that table. They're sitting on a small table. So it's literally as obvious as that.
And power's a funny thing. Imagine power like the pull of gravity. It pulls matter close to one another, resulting in greater mass. That greater mass has greater gravity and pulls in even more matter until a snowball effect takes over. That is how entire planets form, and power behaves in a similar way. Once power starts getting concentrated, it's very hard to stop that trend. And we've seen time and time again as EU nations grapple with EU directives on things as diverse as nitrogen mitigation plans, like in the case of Netherlands or the UK in the case of asylum and immigration. Those nations often just have to go along to get along because it's clear that the EU as a globalist body has accumulated enough power and influence to make that happen.
You know, I've worked for American companies in a previous life. I even worked for a French company for a brief period of time. I get it. We're living in an interconnected world. I understand that. I am generally pro-free trade, provided it's fair. And I get international business and travel. And, I understand all of these things. But the unit by which we want to live, our ability to determine many things that are very important in our lives, democracy, which for goodness sake is what we fought 2 world wars for, these things really, really matter. And to begin with, my warnings about this were thought to be hysterical. But in the end, it did become a majority view. And I think if you look around Europe now, you'll see political movements that are on the rise who really are talking about similar things, Jordan, to what I was saying 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Nigel Farage was truly the best person to talk about this. He's been at the forefront of taking back national writ from globalist bodies in the case of Brexit and starting a similar brewing sentiment in other nations. Now, while that doesn't exactly threaten the concept or integrity of the European Union, it will certainly wake up the people that lead the Union to realize nationalism cannot so easily be trampled for the sake of hazy collective goals, especially not when power has to be dangerously centralized to make that happen. Now, let me know in the comments if you see a similar trend unfolding, because there certainly does seem to be a new political awakening happening on the European continent in the latest decade.